still don't understand what went into that decision by the Supreme Court. Citizens United, just briefly explain to me, how did that happen? What's the climate that led up to that?
Well, people who owe their allegiance to very powerful interests appointed justices who would then owe their allegiance to those same powerful interests. What the court did basically is married two legal doctrines, neither of which can be found in the Constitution. So this is a fabrication, a legal fabrication. But they married two doctrines. One comes from the 1880s. It's the doctrine that corporations are people. It comes from a case, it originated in a case called Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which was not a case at all about whether corporations have citizenship rights. It was a taxation case, a case on taxation of railroad property. And a court clerk added a footnote that's to the ruling that said it's the opinion of the justices that corporations have rights as citizens under the 14th Amendment. Future courts used that as precedent to establish the doctrine of corporate personhood. So you've got this idea that corporations are people, corporations are citizens with rights. Now that doesn't come from the Constitution. You can read the Constitution from the very first word, we, as in we the people, to the very last word of the 27th Amendment, as a matter of fact. You will never find the word corporation anywhere in the Constitution. The Constitution spells out the rights of citizens, not corporations. The court interpreted that Constitution, despite the lack of that word, to mean that corporations have rights as citizens. And then there was the ruling I mentioned before. It came from 1976 in a case called Buckley versus Vallejo. That's where the court effectively ruled that money equals speech. Now, if you marry those two doctrines, if corporations are people and money equals speech, then the corporations have the First Amendment right to spend as much money as they please to influence elections. And the court then came to the conclusion that there could be no limit placed on corporate election spending or spending by other wealthy interest groups. That opened the floodgates. In Wisconsin, we already had a raging campaign arms race before Citizens United in 2010. We looked at the 2006 and 2008 election cycles. $124 million was spent on Wisconsin elections in those two election cycles. Then go to the 2010 and 2012 election cycles, $392 million was spent on Wisconsin elections, spending more than tripled. So, the court dropped a bomb on the landscape of democracy, saying that wealthy interests can spend as much as they want to buy elections. That's what we're faced with. And that's why I would say that we need to overturn Citizens United and related cases like Buckley versus Vallejo. We need to amend the Constitution. But, again, I come back to the idea that $392 million could be matched if 5% of the population would give donations of no more than $100. We could match that money. Pardon?
You have to have sufficient number of candidates who are going to run on a progressive agenda.
And I think that's where you need political party reform. I think what we've got right now, pardon me if anybody takes offense to this, but I think what we've got right now is one party that is scary and another that is scared. And like I said, they're not the same, but they're both failing America, but they're failing for different reasons. But I don't think one party could be as scary as it is if the other one wasn't as scared as it is. And this is a moment that cries out for boldness, for big ideas, and for ambitious political agendas, and that isn't coming from the current arrangement. That's where I think in the past, people with a lot less money than we have today, a lot less education, far fewer means of communication, facing very similar kinds of challenges. They faced the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers. We faced the Koch brothers and the Walton family, right? Eerily reminiscent conditions. They rose up against those same kinds of forces, but one of the really radical things that they did, the subversive things that they did, is they embraced they established a new political identity. They said, we are not one of those anymore. We're not elephants, we're not asses, we're for something brand new. I think there's some power to that act that I urge you to contemplate. Because if you get a candidate and they run as a Democrat, and the Democratic Party establishment is saying, keep your head down, don't say anything too don't say anything controversial. Be as meek and as mild and as unassuming as possible. That's not going to get us to the point where we will have the kind of movement that gets us policies that we desire. This is a moment for boldness, but I think it won't come from the party establishment. I have fought against money in politics for a very long time. The Democratic Party pushed legislation that would double the size of campaign contributions in Wisconsin. Now I think we've got that bill killed. I think we've got it stopped in the state Senate. It passed in the Assembly on a bipartisan vote. The party leadership on the Democratic side wanted it, lobbied for it. How on earth could you convince any normal, sane person that we don't have enough money in politics and we should double the size of campaign contributions? For crying out loud. I think this is a time where people have to say, that's not what we are. That's not a reflection of our values, and start thinking about establishing a new political identity. Not with the idea of creating 3 political parties, but rather with the clear goal of creating one that's worth it.
We really have 3 though with the Tea Party.
Well, actually, one of the reasons I started thinking about this whole idea of establishing a new political identity is because of what the Kochs did with the Tea Party. They were planning the launching of the Tea Party for 10 years before they finally sprung it on the American people. There's nothing grassroots or spontaneous about the Tea Party movement. They were plotting it for 10 years. That's documented. They found what they thought was the proper moment, and they launched it. The interesting thing, the thing that fascinated me about the Tea Party, is they didn't try to create a party. They tried to create a new brand, a new identity, and an agenda that would go along with that identity. They borrowed an iconic image from America's history, the Boston Tea Party, and they used it to create a new identity to take over a party. And they have met with great success. They have warped the Republican Party to a considerable extent. Now, if the Kochs understand the power of establishing a new political identity and working within a 2-party structure to subvert the system for their own selfish aims, for their own enrichment, why the heck can't citizens use the exact same strategy, the same shrewd strategic thinking to create a movement that would promote the common good and the public interest and put citizens back in the driver's seat of at least one political party in this country? I think it's really interesting that the Kochs understood you cannot make the change they desired by creating 3 parties. You have to go in and take over one that exists because we have a 2-party system. They are very shrewd political operators. I tip my cap to them. They understand what they're doing. They planned it for a long time. They have achieved great success, and they have done so simply to enrich themselves. Charles Koch was quoted as saying, "I only want my fair share, which is all of it." Now, we have got to think, if we're going to think that maybe we should have some concept of the common good, we've got to be as smart and as politically shrewd as the Kochs have been in their own self-interest on behalf of the public interest. That's the thing that I think we've got our work cut out for us. But there's no reason why we can't do it, because much poorer people than the Kochs use the same strategy in Ripon, in the time of slavery, and then during the progressive movement. People rose up against the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And how did they do it? Well, it started with them saying, we're not Republicans. we're something brand new. We're something that America ain't never seen before. And the establishment of that identity had a tremendous effect.
I've heard something lately coming from both liberal on NPR and from conservatives too, that we need to have a constitutional convention. Some people even who are in favor of moving to amend are in favor of that. It terrifies me. The thought of a constitutional convention terrifies me. Because they could go in and completely rewrite the Constitution.
Now, I'm not an advocate of a constitutional convention.
I'm not either.
And actually, I think citizens,
When you hear it.
but one thing I will say about the fear of a constitutional convention is this. No, you can't rewrite the entire Constitution in a constitutional convention because you still have to get it ratified in the majority of states. And if it is a totally Republican rewrite, if it's bright red, blue states will reject it. If it's a totally Democratic rewrite, and it's a bright blue rewrite of the Constitution, the red states will reject it. So I actually think that there's not as much to fear about a constitutional convention as some would instinctively feel. But having said that, still, the change that we need starts here. It doesn't start with the passage of a law or the amendment of the Constitution. It starts inside of us. It's not going to come from the establishment. It's got to come from the people. I read the most, if you'll indulge me, this one story. I read this wonderful article by some African-American guy. I do not know him. But he wrote this wonderful article about what Martin Luther King really did. He said, King was known for the passage of landmark civil rights legislation and giving great speeches. He said those were not his most significant accomplishments. This guy said what King really did is he got African American people to give up their fear of white rage. His theory, learned from Gandhi in India, was that white people could only control black people by lynching a few or brutalizing a few and terrorizing the rest of the population. He said if you give up your fear, if you even are willing to accept the beating and not be terrorized, not be beaten into submission, they can't control us because they're not willing to commit genocide. They're not willing to lynch all of us. And once he was able to convince enough people to give up their fear, one of the points he made is that the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all of that, those were white men's laws that were passed just to accommodate the change in America that had already occurred because the hearts of African American people had changed. That's what I'm really driving at here as well. We've got to give up our resignation that there's nothing we can do about this. And we've got to have that revolutionary spirit that democracy is something that we can have if we treat it more as a verb and less as a noun. Something that we do, it's not something that we have. So to hell with constitutional conventions and all this sort of stuff. I think the revolution has to start within us. And once we give up our fear of the Koch brothers and give up our resignation that the system is bought and there's nothing that we can do about it, eventually constitutions will be changed and laws will be changed to reflect the new reality. But we got to create that new reality.
Do you think the Occupy movement is a precursor to the blue jean movement?
I think one of the fascinating things to me is that the Occupy movement and the Tea Party movement have one very important thing in common. And it might be the only thing that they've got in common. And that's the very deep-seated fear that people have, the anxiety that people have about the downsizing of the American dream. I think the one thing that is so central to all the concern about politics today is that people are scared to death that their children and grandchildren are going to be the first generations of Americans to be less well off than their parents. And they don't see a clear path to the middle class, and they don't see a clear path to the American dream for their kids and their grandkids. And it scares people to death. And I think it's the central fear that drives the Tea Party. They reach certain conclusions based on that fear, and it drives the Occupy movement, and they reach very different conclusions about what needs to happen because of that fear, but they share the fear in common. Now the question is whether you talked about liberals and conservatives. We've got to think about that vocabulary. We've got political vocabulary that really doesn't make any sense anymore. To me, the Democratic Party has become the true conservative party in America. If you look up the definition of the word conservative, it means sort of keeping things the way they are. Well, the Democrats are the ones who are trying to keep things the way they are and protect Social Security and protect Medicare and kind of protect all of the great reforms of the past. And it's the Republicans who are trying to blow stuff up. They're the ones who are on the on the move and trying to dismantle everything. And yet they're called the conservatives? Conservatives are supposed to try to maintain the status quo, keep things the way they are. And they're reactionary, they're radicals, and the Democrats are kind of trying to just protect what we've got and kind of try to keep things the way. And that got me to thinking, why are we accepting a horizontal political spectrum with people on the left and people on the right? If you flip that spectrum vertically, and you don't think about who's left and who's right, but think about who's on the top and who's on the bottom, then the Tea Party members are not on the right, Occupy members are not on the left. They're actually pretty much on the same place on a vertical spectrum. When you think about who's on top in America and who's on the bottom and who's in between, there are ways to unite people if we have the imagination to start creating a different way of talking about politics and a different way of thinking about politics. And that's where I think a blue jean movement can help unite people who now are divided, but actually have much more in common than most people think. But they're being told that we have to have very vastly different Americas. And they're being propagandized to death. And there are ways out of this trap. Imagine two people. One is black and the other is white. They both are working people and they're poor. One lives out on the farm country and the other lives in inner city Milwaukee. The black person's probably on the left of the ideological spectrum, and the person living out in farm country is probably on the right. One's probably Republican, the other's probably Democrat. You put them on a vertical spectrum and they probably are in the exact same spot. And they face most of the exact same problems and challenges. They've got the same fears, the same anxieties, same love of country, and yet the way we are thinking and talking about politics divides them. I think maybe there is a way to not only imagine a new political identity, but imagine a new political vocabulary. Instead of talking liberals and conservatives, maybe we talk about royals and commoners. Maybe we talk about boots and stilts. I mean, we're living in a stilted age where certain people have been lifted above the floodwaters and everybody else watching their homes and their futures wash away. You've got certain people who've been elevated up on stilts. Maybe we should talk about stilts and boots, the kind with the straps that you pull yourself up by. When you start thinking about royals and commoners in American politics, think about where people identify then. Do people on the right really think of themselves as royals? Or do they think of themselves as commoners? And do they start having something in common with you? I think there's ways out of the traps that we've set for ourselves, or that have been set for us, and that we've been ensnared in. And I think this is where hope can be found in American politics, is this idea that we can invent our way out of this. And because it's been done before, people have figured out how to break this same kind of stranglehold that too much in concentrated wealth and too much concentrated political power creates.
I think somebody said that greed knows no limit, and people that have money, people that are wealthy, are constantly going to try to get more.
Yeah.
And it's just in their nature, or something that is, that's what this is all about.
Mm-hmm.
Just want more.
Yep.
Well, how?
But that doesn't mean they have to be allowed to,
No.
or
no,
indulge.
No. But what can we do to counteract that? I mean, we're playing a game here where we're trying to match the money that the Coke funders are spending. I don't, is that going to be a winning strategy? Just
well, I only,
basis on money?
I only talk about the 5% solution to illustrate that you would not have to have campaign finance reform or a constitutional amendment to create equal money for commoners and royals. All it would take is 5% of the population giving no more than $100, and you'd match their money. I'm not suggesting that you should, that the solution is to match their money. I really think that what the people have is numbers. You get the power of organized people.
If they would only use that.
Exactly. But there again, I think that's where the key still comes down to the establishment of a new political identity. Because I think what's holding so many people back is they say, man, those Republicans scare the daylights out of me. But man, the Democrats are so disappointing and so uninspiring. Or on the other side, they're saying, man, those Democrats are loony. But holy cow, you know, how can I belong to the Republican Party? And they're politically homeless. They don't have a household to move into. And I think that was La Follette's genius. That was the genius of the abolitionists who gathered in Ripon. They said, let's create a household that people want to move into, that people can feel thrilled about belonging to. Now, who's really thrilled about being a Republican or a Democrat today? How many people are really thrilled with the condition of the political parties? And that's what they did, is they created something people could be thrilled about. And that gives people a place where they can organize. And I think until such a household is constructed, people will wait, and they'll bide their time. Well, then why can't some of us people just decide not to bide our time and actually create something? But I do think it's important to do it with eyes wide open, to understand that we do not have a three-party system. This is not a parliamentary democracy. We don't have factions that create coalition governments like in Europe. We don't have proportional representation. There is no instant runoff voting or choice voting that would get rid of the disadvantages that third parties and third-party candidates now face. We have a two-party system, so how do you work within that two-party structure to create something that will work for the people? It's been done before. It's been done right here in Wisconsin with great effect. So we don't have to make history. We just have to repeat history. And I think when we do that, people are ready, is my sense. People are really ready, past ready.
But the threat is out there that if you take away the power from the royals, they're gonna move out of the country, and then the blue jean people won't have any employment.
Well, people have been made to fear taking any political action. And that's exactly, isn't that exactly what Martin Luther King was confronting? He was facing a population that was terrorized, that was just keeping their heads down, keeping their mouths shut, staying out of the way for fear of a beating. And what King did, and I think this author was absolutely right, King's great accomplishment was getting people past that fear and being willing to say, you know what? They can't kill us all. And since they can't kill us all, if we stand together and we remain united in the face of the brutality, it will crumble. Now, if people understand that economic growth is not driven by supply, it is not produced by the 1%. Economic growth is driven by demand. If people have money in their pockets and they want to spend some money, there will always be somebody who will supply what people demand. Always.
I want,
Listen, there's that famous quote. There's that famous quote, if people were ready to hang the capitalists would sell them the rope. If people have money in their pockets and they want to spend, there will be people who are willing to build the factories and produce the products to meet that demand. And so I think the fear that people feel is real, but it's the same doggone fear that kept black people from gaining the independence that King ended up making possible for them. We got to do the same thing that King did. Absolutely.
I have a real problem with some of the press. We have a black president, and we have so many bigots in this country, in Congress, and the press is giving them so much, they're every time they open their mouth and say, we've heard this last week that the president should be shot and the president should be run out of the country and all this kind of stuff by a couple of elected people. But they're getting press, and the more press they get, the more ignorant people will